Hey there, friend. Welcome to another journey into the dusty corners of history, where the stories are real but told gently enough to help you drift off into peaceful sleep. Whether it's midnight where you are, or you're settling in for an afternoon rest, I'm glad you found your way here. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the globe. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all scattered across different time zones. Yet here we are, sharing these quiet moments with the past. If this kind of storytelling helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you peace. We have many more tales from the forgotten corners of history, waiting to lull you into restful sleep. Now, dim the lights, pull those blankets a little closer, and let your breathing slow as we step back in time. Tonight, we're not heading to battlefields or royal courts. Instead, we're walking down the dusty main streets of frontier towns, where the only law was what a man could enforce with his own two hands, and justice was measured in heartbeats and the speed of a draw. The American West wasn't the romanticized world of Hollywood films, with noble sheriffs and clear-cut heroes riding into perfect sunsets. No, it was something far more complex, brutal, and strangely human. It was a place where survival often came down to split-second decisions, where reputations were built on whispered stories in saloons, and where a single moment of violence could echo through generations. Picture, if you will, a world where the nearest law might be days away by horseback, where disputes were settled not in courtrooms, but in the middle of dirt streets, with nothing but 20 paces and the weight of a Colt revolver determining right from wrong. This was the reality for thousands of people who pushed westward in the decades following the Civil War, carrying their hopes, their fears, and all too often, their violence with them. But let's start not with the famous names you might recognize, not with the legends that have been polished by time and Hollywood glamour, but with the quiet desperation that drove ordinary people to extraordinary moments of brutality. Because the most devastating shootouts in the Wild West weren't always the ones that made it into dime novels. They were the ones that started over a poker game gone wrong, a dispute over cattle, or simply because two men looked at each other the wrong way on a Tuesday afternoon when the heat was unbearable and tempers ran shorter than water in a drought. The thing about violence in the Old West is that it was rarely romantic. There were no dramatic monologues before the shooting started, no time for reflection or noble speeches about justice. Most gunfights lasted only seconds, filled with smoke, confusion, and the terrible finality of lead finding flesh. Men died not with poetic last words, but with surprised gasps, often not understanding what had just happened to them. Take the case of a shootout that occurred in Dodge City on a sweltering July evening in 1878. Now, Dodge City has become synonymous with Wild West violence in popular culture, but the reality was far more mundane and infinitely more tragic than any movie could capture. The trouble began, as it so often did, with alcohol and wounded pride. A cattle driver named James Morrison had been drinking steadily since noon, celebrating the successful delivery of a herd from Texas. By evening, he was that particular kind of drunk where everything feels like a personal insult and every glance seems like a challenge. Across the saloon, a local merchant named Thomas Brennan was playing cards with 3 other men, occasionally glancing toward Morrison not out of any particular interest, but simply because Morrison was getting increasingly loud and disruptive. In Morrison's alcohol-clouded mind, those glances became stares, the stares became insults, and the insults, well, they became something that couldn't be ignored. The other patrons in the saloon sensed the tension building like the pressure before a thunderstorm. Conversations grew quieter, men shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, and the bartender began slowly moving bottles away from the area where trouble was clearly brewing. Morrison stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound that seemed to echo louder than it should have in the suddenly quiet room. He walked over to Brennan's table, his boots heavy on the floorboards, each step measured but unsteady, When he reached the table, he didn't speak immediately. He just stood there, swaying slightly, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver in a gesture that was both casual and unmistakably threatening. Brennan looked up from his cards, his face carefully neutral. He was a businessman, not a gunfighter, but he'd lived in Dodge City long enough to recognize the signs of a man looking for trouble. The other card players slowly pushed their chairs back from the table, creating space and distance, the universal reaction of men who had seen this particular dance before. "You got something to say to me, Morrison?" Brennan asked quietly, his voice steady, despite the fear that was surely building in his chest. Morrison's response was slurred but clear enough. "You've been staring at me all night like I'm some kind of circus animal. I don't appreciate being looked at like that by some shopkeeper who thinks he's better than a working man. Now, in the movies, this would be the moment for a speech about honor or justice, for someone to try to diffuse the situation with wisdom or humor. But this was real life, and real life in the Wild West was often disappointingly short on wisdom and long on pride. Brennan, perhaps feeling the eyes of the entire saloon on him, perhaps simply reacting to the insult, made the fatal mistake of letting his own pride override his common sense. "I'll look where I please," he said, standing up from his chair. "And I don't need to justify myself to a drunk cowboy who can't tell the difference between an accidental glance and an intentional slight." The silence that followed was the kind that makes your ears ring. A stillness so complete that you could hear the ticking of the clock behind the bar, the slight wheeze of the man with consumption who always sat in the corner, the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere down the street. Everyone in the saloon knew that words had just been spoken that couldn't be taken back, that pride had drawn a line in the sawdust that neither man could cross without losing face. Morrison's hand moved to his gun. Not quickly, not in the lightning-fast draw of legend, but deliberately, like a man who had made a decision and was seeing it through to its conclusion. Brennan, seeing the movement, reached for his own weapon, but his hand was shaking, whether from fear or anger, or simply the terrible knowledge of what was about to happen. The shots, when they came, were almost anticlimactic. 2 quick bangs, muffled by the enclosed space, followed by the acrid smell of gunpowder and the heavier, more disturbing scent of blood. Morrison had been faster, or perhaps just more committed to the act of killing, and his bullet caught Brennan in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the table behind him. But Brennan's shot, fired almost reflexively as he fell, had found its mark too, striking Morrison in the stomach, a wound that would prove just as fatal, but far slower to finish its work. Brennan died almost immediately, his last words a whispered, "Why?" that no one was quite sure how to answer. Morrison lived for 3 more hours, long enough for the doctor to arrive and shake his head gravely, long enough for Morrison to realize what his pride had cost him, long enough to whisper apologies that no one was there to hear except the bartender who stayed with him until the end. By morning, both men were dead over a dispute that had started with nothing more than an accidental glance across a crowded saloon. Their families, notified by telegram, would arrive days later to collect bodies and try to make sense of how a successful cattle drive had ended in a double funeral. The saloon would be cleaned, the bloodstains scrubbed from the floor, and within a week, new patrons would be sitting at the same tables, perhaps never knowing that 2 men had died there over something so trivial that it barely qualified as a reason. This was the reality of violence in the Old West, far removed from the noble duels and righteous vengeance of popular imagination. It was sudden, senseless, and irreversible, leaving behind not legends but grieving widows, fatherless children, and communities that had to somehow continue functioning, despite the knowledge that death could arrive as quickly as a harsh word and a moment of wounded pride. But Dodge City was just one town among many, and Morrison and Brennan were just 2 names among thousands who found themselves on the wrong end of frontier justice. As we continue our journey through these dusty streets and smoky saloons, we'll meet more souls who discovered that, in the Wild West, the line between life and death was often thinner than the patience of a man with a gun and nothing left to lose. So settle back now. Let your breathing slow and prepare to walk with me through the shadows of a time when justice wore a six-shooter and mercy was a luxury few could afford. The stories we'll share are harsh ones, but told gently in the quiet of the night, they become something else entirely, reminders of our shared humanity, even in its darkest moments. The dust was still settling from that tragic evening in Dodge City when word began to spread along the cattle trails and through the mining camps of another kind of violence altogether. You see, while Morrison and Brennan had killed each other over wounded pride and too much whiskey, there were others in the West who made violence their profession, who turned the quick draw and steady aim into something approaching an art form, though it was an art that painted only in shades of red. Let your eyes grow heavy as we drift now toward the railroad town of Newton, Kansas, where the summer heat of 1871 hung over the streets like a wool blanket, and where tempers ran as hot as the iron rails that brought Texas longhorns and the men who drove them northward to market. Newton was what they called an end-of-track town, one of those rough settlements that sprouted like weeds wherever the railroad stopped, filled with saloons, gambling halls, and the kind of establishments that catered to men who had been on the trail for months with nothing but cattle and dust for company. The trouble in Newton didn't start with a glance or an insult. It began with something far more serious in the currency of the frontier: money. A group of Texas cowboys, led by a man named Hugh Anderson, had been cheated out of their pay by a crooked gambler who went by the name of Mike McCluskey. Now, McCluskey wasn't just any card sharp. He was also the town marshal, which gave him a certain immunity to complaints about his gambling practices and a badge to back up his questionable ethics. Anderson and his men had ridden hard for 3 months to get their cattle to the railroad, sleeping under stars and eating dust, dreaming of the money they'd earn and the good time they'd have spending it, to discover that the man who was supposed to keep the peace was the same man who had systematically robbed them at the poker table, was the kind of insult that went beyond pride and straight to survival. The confrontation, when it came, wasn't in a saloon or on a dusty street at high noon. It happened in Tuttle's Dance Hall, a ramshackle building on the outskirts of town where the music was loud, the liquor was cheap, and the women were willing to dance with any man who had silver in his pocket and wasn't too particular about asking their names. Picture the scene: oil lamps casting flickering shadows on rough wooden walls, a piano that had seen better decades playing tunes that everyone knew but nobody could quite remember the words to, and the constant hum of conversation mixed with laughter that had an edge to it, the kind of laughter that comes from men who are one drink away from trouble and don't particularly care which side of it they land on. McCluskey was holding court at a corner table, his marshal's badge catching the lamplight, a bottle of whiskey at his elbow and a pile of coins in front of him that represented more money than most cowboys saw in a year. He was telling a story about something or other, probably about how smart he was and how stupid everyone else was, the kind of story that men like him loved to tell, and that everyone else had to pretend to find amusing. Anderson and 3 of his men entered the dance hall just after 10 o'clock, their spurs jingling on the wooden floor, their faces set in the grim expressions of men who had come to settle accounts. The music didn't stop, but it got quieter, and conversations died down to whispers as people began to sense that something was about to happen, something that would be talked about for years to come. Anderson walked directly to McCluskey's table, not hurrying, but not wasting time either, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a gesture that everyone in the room understood perfectly. His men spread out behind him, not surrounding the table, but positioning themselves so they could see the room, and, more importantly, so the room could see them. "McCluskey," Anderson said, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet space. "We need to have a conversation about some money that went missing from a poker game." McCluskey looked up from his drink, his eyes taking in Anderson and his men with the practiced assessment of a man who had been in similar situations before. The badge on his chest gave him authority, but authority was only useful if people respected it, and respect was earned through more than just a piece of tin pinned to a vest. "I don't recall any money going missing," McCluskey replied, his voice steady, but carrying an undertone that suggested he was measuring distances and angles, calculating odds the way gamblers always did. "I recall some cowboys who were too drunk to know when to fold." What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a landslide. Anderson's hand moved toward his gun, not in a quick draw, but in a deliberate motion that gave McCluskey time to see it coming, time to make his own choice. McCluskey chose to meet the challenge, his own hand dropping to his weapon with the smooth motion of a man who had practiced the movement until it was as natural as breathing. But Anderson wasn't alone, and this wasn't a fair fight between two men settling a dispute with honor. This was 4 angry cowboys against 1 crooked marshal. And the mathematics of gunfighting have never been kind to those who find themselves outnumbered. The shooting, when it began, filled the dance hall with smoke and screaming, with the crash of overturned tables and the sound of boots running for the door. McCluskey got his gun out first, his experience and natural ability serving him well in those crucial first seconds. His shot caught Anderson in the chest, a killing blow that should have ended the fight then and there. But Anderson, even as he fell, managed to fire his own weapon, and his bullet struck McCluskey in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing his second shot to go wide. The other cowboys opened fire then, their weapons barking in rapid succession, filling the air with lead and smoke. McCluskey, wounded but still standing, tried to return their fire, but he was 1 man against 3, and the odds were simply too great. Bullets struck him in the chest, the stomach, the leg, each impact staggering him but somehow not dropping him, as if sheer stubbornness was keeping him upright. The entire gunfight lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though to those caught in the middle of it, it must have seemed like hours. When the smoke cleared and the echoes of the shots faded away, 5 men lay on the floor of Tuttle's dance hall. Anderson was dead, as was McCluskey, along with 2 of the cowboys and an unlucky bystander who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the Newton massacre, as the newspapers would later call it, wasn't over. News of the shootout spread quickly through the town, and within an hour, friends and allies of both sides were gathering in the streets, armed and angry, looking for someone to blame and someone to shoot. The violence that had started over a poker game threatened to consume the entire town in a wave of retribution and counter-retribution. By dawn, 11 more men would be dead, shot down in running gun battles that moved from saloon to street to boarding house, as the original dispute expanded like ripples in a pond, until it touched nearly every corner of Newton's small community. Families barricaded themselves in their homes, businesses shuttered their windows, and the few remaining peace officers sent desperate telegrams to the state capital, begging for military intervention. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A town that had hired a gunman to keep the peace had been nearly destroyed by the very violence he was supposed to prevent. McCluskey's badge, found beside his body in the wreckage of the dance hall, was bent and blood-stained, a fitting symbol for the failure of law and order in a place where might made right. And justice was whatever the man with the fastest draw said it was. In the end, Newton survived, as frontier towns usually did, by the simple expedient of cleaning up the blood, burying the dead, and pretending that what had happened was an aberration rather than an inevitable result of the way they had chosen to live. New businesses opened, new people arrived, and within a few months, Tuttle's dance hall was rebuilt and operating again, though local wisdom suggested avoiding the corner where McCluskey had made his last stand. The survivors of that terrible night carried their memories with them like scars, stories they would tell in whispered conversations for the rest of their lives. They had seen what happened when pride and money and wounded dignity collided in a place where there was no law except what men made for themselves, and they had learned that sometimes the price of that kind of freedom was measured in coffins and tears. But Newton was just one town, and McCluskey and Anderson were just 2 names among the many who discovered that, in the Wild West, there were no heroes or villains, only men who lived and men who died. And the difference between them was often nothing more than luck and timing, and the willingness to pull a trigger when the moment came. Close your eyes now, and let the night settle around you like dust on a quiet street. There are more stories waiting in the darkness, more souls who learned too late that violence begets violence, and that the only winners in a gunfight are the undertakers who come to clean up the mess. The night air in Tombstone, Arizona, hung heavy with the scent of sage and the promise of rain that never seemed to come. October 26th, 1881, dawned like any other day in this silver mining town tucked into the Dragoon Mountains. But by sunset, it would be remembered as the day when the most famous gunfight in Western history turned a vacant lot behind the OK Corral into hallowed ground soaked with blood and legend. Let your breathing slow as we walk these dusty streets together, past the Oriental Saloon where fortunes were won and lost on the turn of a card, past the Birdcage Theatre where painted ladies danced for miners flush with silver coin, past the offices of the Tombstone Epitaph where editor John Clum would soon be setting type for headlines that would echo through eternity. But this wasn't a story that began with noble intentions or clear lines between right and wrong. Like most tales of Western violence, it started with money, politics, and the kind of personal grudges that fester in small towns where everyone knows everyone else's business and most people wish they didn't. The Earp brothers, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan, had come to Tombstone following the Silver Strike, not as lawmen, but as businessmen looking to profit from the boom. Wyatt had interests in gambling houses and saloons. Virgil had been appointed city marshal, and Morgan was content to follow his older brother's lead in whatever enterprise seemed most profitable. They were not the squeaky clean heroes of later legend, but pragmatic men who understood that in a town built on silver and speculation, the real money was made not in the mines, but in the pockets of the miners. Opposing them were the Clantons and McClorys, ranchers and businessmen in their own right, men who had been in the territory longer and resented the newcomers who seemed to think their badges and reputations gave them the right to dictate terms to established residents. Ike Clanton in particular had built his wealth through methods that didn't always align with territorial law, running cattle that may not have always belonged to him, and maintaining friendships with men whose occupations were best not examined too closely. The tension between these two factions had been building for months, fed by newspaper editorials, saloon gossip, and the kind of political maneuvering that turned every civic issue into a personal affront. There had been threats and counter-threats, accusations and denials, the slow escalation of rhetoric that turns neighbors into enemies and makes violence seem not just inevitable, but necessary. On that particular morning, Ike Clanton had been drinking since before dawn, working up the kind of liquid courage that made large problems seem smaller and dangerous men seem manageable. By noon, he was walking the streets of Tombstone with a Winchester rifle and a head full of grievances, looking for Wyatt Earp and making it clear to anyone who would listen that he intended to settle their differences permanently. Word of Clanton's threats reached the Earps quickly, as word always did in a town small enough that a man couldn't sneeze on Allen Street without someone on Fremont Street saying Gesundheit. Virgil, as city marshal, had the authority and arguably the duty to disarm Clanton, but when he found him, Ike had put away the rifle and was carrying only a pistol, which put the situation in a legal grey area that frontier law wasn't particularly equipped to handle. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't the result of a formal challenge or a scheduled duel. It developed organically, the way most violence did in the West, through a series of small decisions and missed opportunities, each one pushing the situation a little further toward the point of no return. Shortly after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Virgil Earp, accompanied by his brothers Wyatt and Morgan and their friend Doc Holliday, walked down Fremont Street toward a vacant lot behind Camillus Fly's photography studio. There, in a space barely 15 feet wide, they found Ike and Billy Clanton, along with Tom and Frank McClory, all armed and apparently waiting for exactly this kind of meeting. The conversation that followed was brief and tense, filled with the kind of formal politeness that men use when they're trying to avoid saying what they really mean. Virgil, as the lawman, ordered the Clantons and McClorys to throw up their hands and surrender their weapons. The response was not compliance, but defiance, hands moving toward guns in the universal gesture that meant words were finished and lead would do the talking. What happened next lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though accounts vary and witnesses would spend the rest of their lives arguing about who shot first, who shot last, and who was justified in shooting at all. The narrow lot filled with smoke and flame, with the crash of gunfire echoing off the adobe walls of the surrounding buildings, with men shouting and cursing and dying in the space of a few heartbeats. Billy Clanton, barely 20 years old, went down early with bullets in his chest and abdomen, but kept fighting from the ground, his pistol barking defiantly until his strength finally failed him. Tom McClory, caught without a weapon in his hands, tried to use his horse for cover, but caught a shotgun blast from Doc Holliday that ended his participation in the fight and his life simultaneously. Frank McClory proved to be the most dangerous of the bunch, wounded but still standing, still shooting, his bullets finding their mark in Morgan Earp's shoulder and Doc Holliday's hip, before Wyatt's Colt finally put him down with a shot to the stomach that doubled him over and dropped him to his knees in the dust. When the smoke cleared, 3 men lay dead, Billy Clanton and both McClory brothers, their blood seeping into the alkaline soil of that vacant lot. The Earp party had been wounded but survived, though Morgan would carry his injuries for the rest of his considerably shortened life, and Doc Holliday's hip would never be quite right again. Ike Clanton, despite being the one who had started the trouble with his morning threats and his alcohol-fueled bravado, had run at the first sound of gunfire, proving that liquid courage had its limits when faced with actual lead. He would live to testify against the Earps in the murder trial that followed, though his credibility was somewhat damaged by his conspicuous absence during the actual shooting. The aftermath of the OK Corral gunfight was far more complex than the simple triumph of good over evil that later writers would make it out to be. The Earps were arrested and charged with murder, then acquitted after a preliminary hearing that revealed the legal and moral ambiguities of the situation. Public opinion in Tombstone was divided, with some viewing the lawmen as heroes who had cleaned up the town, and others seeing them as murderous bullies who had used their badges to justify personal vengeance. The violence didn't end with the trial. Morgan Earp was assassinated while playing billiards 3 months later, shot through a window by unknown assailants who were widely believed to be friends of the dead McClorys. Virgil was wounded in an ambush that left his left arm permanently crippled. Wyatt, faced with the failure of territorial law to protect his family, organized what he called a vendetta ride, hunting down the men he believed responsible for his brother's injuries, with methods that had more in common with vigilante justice than legal procedure. By the time the smoke finally cleared from the Tombstone War, as the newspapers called it, more than a dozen men were dead. The Earp brothers had left Arizona forever, and the town itself had begun the long slide from silver boom town to tourist attraction that would define its future. The irony of the OK Corral fight was that it solved nothing and settled nothing, except to add 3 more names to the growing list of men who had died for reasons that seemed important at the time, but would be largely forgotten within a generation. The political corruption, the cattle rustling, the conflicts between businessmen and ranchers that had sparked the trouble in the first place continued long after the principals were dead or departed. What remained was the story itself, polished and refined by countless retellings until it became something larger than the sum of its parts, a parable about law and order on the frontier, about the thin line between justice and vengeance, about the price of progress in a land where civilization was still a work in progress. But perhaps that's enough of famous names and legendary gunfights. As you drift deeper into sleep, let us turn away from the stories that made it into history books and toward the countless smaller tragedies, the forgotten shootouts that claimed just as many lives but left no monuments, no movies, no dime novels to preserve their memory. These were the deaths that truly defined the Wild West, the homesteader shot by claim jumpers who wanted his water rights, the saloon keeper killed by a drunk who couldn't pay his tab, the young cowboy who died in an alley behind a whorehouse over a girl whose name he never even knew. Their stories are written in cemetery headstones and faded newspaper clippings, in the memories of descendants who barely remember why great-grandfather left home so suddenly and never spoke of his time in the territories. The Wild West wasn't tamed by famous lawmen or legendary gunfighters. It was civilized by the gradual arrival of telegraph wires and railroad schedules, by federal judges and territorial governors, by the simple passage of time that turned frontier outposts into proper towns with schools and churches and ladies' auxiliary societies that frowned on public displays of violence. The men who had lived by the gun found themselves increasingly out of place in a world that valued commerce over courage, contracts over confrontation. Some adapted, hanging up their holsters and becoming respectable businessmen or peace officers. Others drifted further west, chasing the retreating frontier until there was no more frontier to chase. And some simply faded away, their names forgotten, their stories untold, their graves unmarked in the potter's fields of a dozen dusty settlements. But their legacy lived on in the myths and legends that grew up around their violence, stories that transformed brutal killings into noble sacrifices, that turned desperate men into heroes, that painted the chaos of the frontier in the romantic colours of adventure and justice. The real Wild West died with the 19th century, but the imagined West lives on, forever frozen in that moment when right and wrong could be settled with 6 shots and 20 paces, when a man's word was his bond and his gun was his law. So rest now, friend, and let the night take you gently. The gunfighters are all sleeping now, their weapons silent, their quarrels ended. The saloon doors no longer swing with the passage of dangerous men. The streets no longer echo with the sound of spurs and the whispered warnings of trouble brewing. The Wild West has passed into memory, into story, into the quiet dreams of those who wonder what it would have been like to live in a time when the horizon held infinite possibilities. And the price of those possibilities was measured in blood and courage and the willingness to face down death with nothing but steel and determination. The dust has settled, the smoke has cleared, and all that remains are the stories we tell in the darkness, gentle reminders of a harder time when justice wore a gun and mercy was a luxury few could afford. Sleep well and dream of quieter times, when the most dangerous thing in the night was the sound of your own heartbeat and the soft whisper of wind through the curtains. The end of the Wild West came not with a bang, but with a whimper, not in a final great gunfight, but in the gradual realization that the age of the gunfighter was over, replaced by a more civilized but perhaps less honest world, where violence was hidden behind lawyers and legislation, where the strong still preyed upon the weak, but did so with contracts instead of Colts. And perhaps, in the end, that was the most brutal shootout of all, the one where the West itself was killed, not by bullets, but by progress, not by outlaws, but by time itself. But that's a story for another night, when the moon is dark and the shadows are long, and the ghosts of the frontier whisper their final secrets to those brave enough to listen. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be peaceful, free from the echoes of gunfire and the weight of history's violence.